Hi, I'm Rashonda Cade. This is Reading with Rashonda, and we are reading William Wells Brown's Clotel. We just finished chapter 12, which ended with Sam doing his own personal minstrel show. And so now we're starting chapter 13. A Slave Hunting Parson. 'Tis too much proved that with devotion's visage and pious action we do sugar o'er the devil himself. Shakespeare. You will no doubt be well pleased with neighbor Jones, said Mr. Peck as Carlton stepped into the chaise to pay his promised visit to the ungodly man. Don't forget to have a religious interview with the Negroes, remarked Georgiana as she gave the last nod to her young convert. I will do my best, returned Carlton as the vehicle left the door. As might have been expected, Carlton met with a cordial reception at the hands of the proprietor of the Grove Farm. The servants in the great house were well dressed and appeared as if they did not want for food. Jones knew that Carlton was from the North and a non-slaveholder, and therefore did everything in his power to make a favorable impression on his mind. My Negroes are well clothed, well fed, and not overworked, said the slaveholder to his visitor, after the latter had been with him nearly a week. As far as I can see, your slaves appear to good advantage, replied Carlton. But, continued he, if it is a fair question, do you have preaching among your slaves on Sunday, Mr. Jones? No, no, returned he. I think that's all nonsense. My Negroes do their own preaching. So you do permit them to have meetings? Yes, when they wish. There's some very intelligent and clever chaps among them. As tomorrow is the Sabbath, said Carlton, if you have no objection, I will attend meeting with them. Most certainly you shall, if you will do the preaching, returned the planter. All right. Here the young man was about to decline, but he remembered the parting words of Georgiana, and he took courage and said, Oh, I have no objection to give the Negroes a short talk. It was then understood that Carlton was to have a religious interview with the blacks the next day, and the young man waited with a degree of impatience for the time. In no part of the South are slaves in a more ignorant and degraded state than in the cotton, sugar, and rice districts. If they are permitted to cease labor on the Sabbath, the time is spent in hunting, fishing, or lying beneath the shade of a tree, resting for the morrow. Religious instruction is unknown in the far South, except among some such men as the Reverend C.C. Jones, John Peck, and some others who regard religious instruction, such as they impart to their slaves, as calculated to make them more trustworthy and valuable as property. Jones, aware that his slaves would make rather a bad show of intelligence if questioned by Carlton, resolved to have them ready for him, and therefore gave his driver orders with regard to their preparation. Consequently, after the day's labor was over, Doggett, the driver, assembled the Negroes together and said, Now, boys and gals, your master is coming down to the quarters tomorrow with his visitor, who is going to give you a preach, and I want you should understand what he says to you. Now, many of you who came from old Virginia and Kentucky know what preaching is, and others who have been raised in these parts do not. Preaching is to tell you that you are mighty wicked and bad at heart. This, I suppose, you all know. But if the gentleman should ask you who made you, tell him the Lord. If he asks you if you wish to go to heaven, tell him yes. Remember that you are all Christians, all love the Lord, all want to go to heaven, all love your masters, and all love me. Now, boys and gals, I want you to show yourselves smart tomorrow. Be on your P's and Q's, and Monday morning I will give you all a glass of whiskey bright and early. Okay, so preaching is to tell you that you are mighty wicked and bad at heart. That is so sad. Preaching is to tell you that Jesus loves you, because he does. I'll continue. Agreeable to arrangement, the slaves were assembled together on Sunday morning under the large trees near the great house, and after going through another drilling from the driver, Jones and Carlton made their appearance. You see, said Jones to the Negroes as he approached them, you see here's a gentleman that's come to talk to you about your souls, and I hope you will pay that attention that you ought. Jones then seated himself on one of the two chairs placed there for him and the stranger. Carlton had already selected a chapter in the Bible to read to them, which he did, after first prefacing it with some remarks of his own. Not being accustomed to speak in public, he determined, after reading the Bible, to make it more of a conversational meeting than otherwise. He began asking them questions. "Do you feel that you are a Christian?" he asked of a full-blooded Negro that sat near him. "Yes, sir," was the response. "You feel, then, that you shall go to heaven?" "Yes, sir." "Of course you know who made you." The man put his hand on his head and began to scratch his wool, and after a little hesitation he answered, "The overseer told us last night who made us, but indeed I forgot the gentleman's name." This reply was almost too much for Carlton, and his gravity was not a little moved. However, he bit his tongue and turned to another man who appeared, from his looks, to be more intelligent. I won't digress. Do you serve the Lord?" asked he. "No, sir. I don't serve anybody but Mr. Jones. I never belong to anybody else." To hide his feelings at this juncture, Carlton turned and walked to another part of the grounds, to where the women were seated, and said to a mulatto woman who had rather an anxious countenance, "Did you ever hear of John the Baptist?" "Oh, yes, master, John the Baptist. I know that nigger very well. He lives in old Kentuck, where I come from." Carlton's gravity here gave way, and he looked at the planter and laughed outright. The old woman knew a slave near her old master's farm in Kentucky, and was ignorant enough to suppose that he was John the Baptist inquired about. Carlton occupied the remainder of the time in reading scripture and talking to them. "My niggers ain't shown off very well today," said Jones, as he and his visitor left the grounds. "No," replied Carlton. "You did not get hold of the bright ones," continued the planter. "So it seems," remarked Carlton. The planter evidently felt that his neighbor, Parson Peck, would have a nut to crack over the account that Carlton would give of the ignorance of the slaves, and said and did all in his power to remove the bad impression already made, but to no purpose. The report made by Carlton on his return amused the parson very much. It appeared to him the best reason why professed Christians like himself should be slaveholders. Not so with Georgiana. She did not even smile when Carlton was telling his story, but seemed sore at heart that such ignorance could prevail in their midst. The question turned upon the heathen of other lands, and the parson began to expatiate upon his own efforts in foreign missions, when his daughter, with a childlike simplicity, said, "Send Bibles to the heathen on every distant shore, from light that's beaming o'er us, let streams increasing pour, but keep it from the millions downtrodden at our door. Send Bibles to the heathen, their famished spirits fed. Oh, haste and join your efforts, the priceless gift to speed. Then flog the trembling Negro if he should learn to read." "I saw a curiosity while at Mr. Jones's that I shall not forget soon," said Carlton. "What was it?" inquired the parson. "A kennel of bloodhounds, and such dogs I never saw before. They were of a species between the bloodhound and the foxhound, and were ferocious, gaunt, and savage-looking animals. They were part of a stock imported from Cuba, he informed me. They were kept in an iron cage and fed on Indian cornbread. This kind of food, he said, made them eager for their business. Sometimes they would give the dogs meat, but it was always after they had been chasing a Negro." "Were those the dogs you had, Papa, to hunt Harry?" asked Georgiana. "No, my dear," was the short reply, and the parson seemed anxious to change the conversation to something else. When Mr. Peck had left the room, Carlton spoke more freely of what he had seen, and spoke more pointedly against slavery, for he well knew that Miss Peck sympathized with him in all he felt and said. "You mentioned about your father hunting a slave," said Carlton in an undertone. "Yes," replied she. "Papa went with some slave catchers and a parcel of those nasty Negro dogs to hunt poor Harry. He belonged to Papa and lived on the farm. His wife lives in town, and Harry had been to see her and did not return quite as early as he should, and Huckleberry was flogging him, and he got away and came here. I wanted Papa to keep him in town so that he could see his wife more frequently, but he said they could not spare him from the farm, and flogged him again and sent him back. The poor fellow knew that the overseer would punish him over again, and instead of going back, he went into the woods." "Did they catch him?" asked Carlton. Yes, replied she. In chasing him through the woods, he attempted to escape by swimming across a river, and the dogs were sent in after him and soon caught him. But Harry had great courage and fought the dogs with a big club, and Papa, seeing the Negro would escape from the dogs, shot at him, as he says, only to wound him, that he might be caught. But the poor fellow was killed. Overcome by relating this incident, Georgiana burst into tears. Although Mr. Peck fed and clothed his house servants well and treated them with a degree of kindness, he was nevertheless a most cruel master. He encouraged his driver to work the field hands from early dawn till late at night, and the good appearance of the house servants and the preaching of Snyder to the field negroes was to cause himself to be regarded as a Christian master. Being on a visit one day from the farm, and having with him several persons from the free states, and wishing to make them believe that his slaves were happy, satisfied, and contented, the parson got out the whiskey and gave each one a dram, who in return had to drink the master's health or give a toast of some kind. The company were not a little amused at some of the sentiments given, and Peck was delighted at every indication of contentment on the parts of the blacks. At last it came to Jack's turn to drink, and the master expected something good from him, because he was considered the cleverest and most witty slave on the farm. "Now," said the master, as he handed Jack the cup of whiskey, "now, Jack, give us something rich. You know," he continued, "we have raised the finest crop of cotton that's been seen in these parts for many a day. Now give us a toast on cotton. Come, Jack, give us something to laugh at." The Negro felt not a little elated at being made the hero of the occasion, and taking the whiskey in his right hand, he put his left to his head and began to scratch his wool, and said, "The big bee flies high, the little bee make the honey, the black folks makes the cotton, and the white folks gets the money." We have had a number of escaped slaves between William Wells Brown's autobiography, with him being an escaped slave, the other escaped slaves he talked about in his narrative, and in the novel itself of Clotel. I just thought it was interesting. I thought about it, so I mentioned it. We're at chapter 14 now. Let's see how long that is. Oh, chapter 14 is short. We'll definitely get through it. Chapter 14, A Free Woman Reduced to Slavery. Althesa found in Henry Morton a kind and affectionate husband, and his efforts to purchase her mother, although unsuccessful, had doubly endeared him to her. We talked about that last time, whether or not he was really looking for Currer. I don't know. We'll just keep reading. Having from the commencement resolved not to hold slaves, or rather not to own any, they were compelled to hire servants for their own use. 5 years had passed away, and their happiness was increased by 2 lovely daughters. Mrs. Morton was seated one bright afternoon, busily engaged with her needle, and near her sat Salome, a servant that she had just taken into her employ. The woman was perfectly white, so much so that Mrs. Morton had expressed her apprehension to her husband when the woman first came, that she was not born a slave. The mistress watched the servant as the latter sat sewing upon some coarse work, and saw the large silent tear in her eye. This caused an uneasiness to the mistress, and she said, "Salome, don't you like your situation here?" "Oh, yes, madam," answered the woman in a quick tone, and then tried to force a smile. "Why is it that you often look sad and with tears in your eyes?" The mistress saw that she had touched a tender chord, and continued, "I am your friend. Tell me your sorrow, and if I can, I will help you." As the last sentence was escaping the lips of the mistress, the slave woman put her cheek upon her cheek, As the last sentence was escaping the lips of the mistress, the slave woman put her check apron to her face and wept. Mrs. Morton saw plainly that there was cause for this expression of grief, and pressed the woman more closely. "Hear me then," said the woman, calming herself. "I will tell you why I sometimes weep. I was born in Germany on the banks of the Rhine. 10 years ago my father came to this country, bringing with him my mother and myself. He was poor, and I, wishing to assist all I could, obtained a situation as a nurse to a lady in this city. My father got employment as a laborer on the wharf among the steamboats, but he was soon taken ill with the yellow fever and died. My mother then got a situation for herself while I remained with my first employer. When the hot season came on, my master with his wife left New Orleans until the hot season was over and took me with them. They stopped at a town on the banks of the Mississippi River and said they should remain there some weeks. One day they went out for a ride, and they had not been gone more than a half an hour when two men came into the room and told me they had bought me and that I was their slave. I was bound and taken to prison, and that night put on a steamboat and taken up the Yazoo River and set to work on a farm. I was forced to take up with a Negro, and by him had 3 children. A year since my master's daughter was married, and I was given to her. She came with her husband to this city, and I have ever since been hired out. Unhappy woman, whispered Althesa. Why did you not tell me this before? I was afraid, replied Salome, for I was once severely flogged for telling a stranger that I was not born a slave. On Mr. Morton's return home, his wife communicated to him the story which the slave woman had told her about an hour before, and begged that something might be done to rescue her from her situation she was in. In Louisiana, as well as many others of the slave states, great obstacles are thrown in the way of persons who have been wrongfully reduced to slavery regaining their freedom. For persons who have been wrongfully reduced to slavery. And I get that. I totally get that. But that also makes it sound like some people have rightfully been reduced to slavery. And it's some people's right position to be slaves and other people's wrong position to be slaves. A person claiming to be free must prove his right to his liberty. That ties in with what we were talking about of pass, but I'll keep reading. This, it will be seen, throws the burden of proof upon the slave, who in all probability finds it out of his power to procure such evidence. And if any free person shall attempt to aid a freeman in regaining his freedom, he is compelled to enter into security in the sum of $1,000, and if the person claiming to be free shall fail to establish such fact, the $1,000 are forfeited to the state. Let's read this again. And if any free person, and if any free person shall attempt to aid a free man in regaining his freedom. Why would a free man have to regain his freedom? I'm sorry, I got all worked up. I'll keep reading. This cruel and oppressive law has kept many a freeman from espousing the cause of persons unjustly held as slaves. Mr. Morton inquired and found that the woman's story was true, as regarded the time she had lived with her present owner, but the latter not only denied that she was free, but immediately removed her from Morton's. 3 months after Salome had been removed from Morton's and let out to another family, she was one morning cleaning the doorsteps when a lady passing by looked at the slave and thought she recognized someone that she had seen before. The lady stopped and asked the woman if she was a slave. "I am," said she. "Were you born a slave?" "No, I was born in Germany." "What's the name of the ship in which you came to this country?" inquired the lady. "I don't know," was the answer. "Was it the Amazon?" At the sound of this name, the tears began to flow freely down her careworn cheeks. "Would you know Mrs. Marshall, who was a passenger in the Amazon, if you should see her?" inquired the lady. At this, the woman gazed at the lady with a degree of intensity that can be imagined better than described, and then fell at the lady's feet. The lady was Mrs. Marshall. She had crossed the Atlantic in the same ship with this poor woman. Salome, like many of her countrymen, was a beautiful singer, and had often entertained Mrs. Marshall and the other lady passengers on board the Amazon. The poor woman was raised from the ground by Mrs. Marshall and placed upon the doorstep that she had a moment before been cleaning. "I will do my utmost to rescue you from the horrid life of a slave," exclaimed the lady, as she took from her pocket a pencil and wrote down the number of the house and the street in which the German woman was working as a slave. After a long and tedious trial of many days, it was decided that Salome Miller was by birth a free woman, and she was set at liberty. The good and generous Althesa had contributed some of the money toward bringing about the trial, and had done much to cheer on Mrs. Marshall in her benevolent object. Salome Miller is free, but where are her 3 children? They are still slaves, and in all human probability will die as such. This, reader, is no fiction. If you think so, look over the files of the New Orleans newspapers of the years 1845 through 1846, and you will there see reports of the trial. This had to have put Althesa in a very precarious situation. She is a person who is masquerading as a free person who is renting out someone who was wrongfully enslaved and is trying to help that person get free. Like, the tangled web of this is fascinating and funny to me, not gonna lie. It's all kinds of irony, and it's supposed to be, right? That's clearly what William Wells Brown intended. So let's go ahead and read chapter 14. It's also short, and then we'll call it a day. I'm sorry, chapter 15. We just read chapter 14. Chapter 15. Oh, today a mistress, tomorrow a slave. I promised thee a sister tale of man's perfidious cruelty. Come then and hear what cruel wrong befell the dark lady. By Coleridge. Let us return for a moment to the home of Clotel. While she was passing lonely and dreary hours with none but her darling child, Horatio Green was trying to find relief in that insidious enemy of man, the intoxicating cup. Defeated in politics, forsaken in love by his wife, he seemed to have lost all principle of honor and was ready to nerve himself up to any deed, no matter how unprincipled. Clotel's existence was now well known to Horatio's wife, and both her and her father demanded that the beautiful quadroon and her child should be sold and sent out of the state. Why had he never set her free? Why? And then his child would have been free because the child would have taken the free condition of her mother. But no, he never set them free. They didn't have any free papers. Horatio. To this proposition he at first turned a deaf ear, but when he saw that his wife was about to return to her father's roof, he consented to leave the matter in the hands of his father-in-law. The result was that Clotel was immediately sold to the slave trader Walker, who a few years previous had taken her mother and sister to the far south. But, as if to make her husband drink of the cup of humiliation to its very dregs, Mrs. Green resolved to take his child under her own roof for a servant. Mary was therefore put to the meanest work that could be found, and although only 10 years of age, she was often compelled to perform labor which under ordinary circumstances would have been thought too hard for one much older. One condition of the sale of Clotel to Walker was that she should be taken out of the state, which was accordingly done. Most quadroon women who are taken to the lower countries to be sold are either purchased by gentlemen for their own use, and we totally know what use that is, or sold for waiting maids. And Clotel, like her sister, was fortunate enough to be bought for the latter purpose. The town of Vicksburg stands on the left bank of the Mississippi and is noted for the severity with which slaves are treated. It was here that Clotel was sold to Mr. James French, a merchant. Mrs. French was severe in the extreme to her servants. Well-dressed but scantily fed and overworked were all who found a home with her. The quadroon had been in her new home but a short time ere she found that her situation was far different from what it was in Virginia. What social virtues are possible in a society of which injustice is the primary characteristic? In a society which is divided into two classes, masters and slaves. Every married woman in the far south looks upon her husband as unfaithful and regards every quadroon servant as a rival. Clotel had been with her new mistress but a few days when she was ordered to cut off her long hair. The Negro, constitutionally, is fond of dress and outward appearance. Like, I just had to chuckle while I was reading that. But let's go back to a second. Every married woman in the far south looks upon her husband as unfaithful and regards every quadroon servant as a rival. That is a gross generalization, yes, but think about it in the context of this novel that started off with saying that Clotel and Althesa were the daughters of Thomas Jefferson, the president. What did Thomas Jefferson's wife think about In the novel, Kerr, the mulatto slave woman, in real life, Sally Hemings, the mulatto slave woman, right? Like, this is clearly hearkening back to the beginning of the novel, where clearly Thomas Jefferson, so let's say Thomas Jefferson's wife, looked upon her husband as unfaithful and regarded every quadroon servant as a rival. In the Jefferson household, my understanding, and historians can fix me, was that people knew about the relationship between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. His wife had reason to regard every quadroon servant as a rival. So we're having like all of this come back full force right here in this sentence to make us think about, what does it mean to be the black daughter of the President of the United States that was conceived out of wedlock, conceived into slavery, and now has the potential of that whole same cycle returning over and over again? All right, Clotel had been with her new mistress but a few days when she was ordered to cut off her long hair. The Negro constitutionally is fond of dress and outward appearance. He that has short woolly hair combs it and oils it to death. He that has long hair would sooner have his teeth drawn than lose it. However painful it was to the quadroon, she was soon seen with her hair cut as short as any of the full-blooded Negroes in the dwelling. I mean, I have to laugh because it's an overgeneralization, but if you look at historically black people and their hair, he's not all wrong about that. Even with her short hair, Clotel was handsome. Her life had been a secluded one, and though now nearly 30 years of age, she was still beautiful. I like to think it a lot more than 30 years of age. I'm still beautiful, and nobody's going to tell me anything different. At her short hair, the other servants laughed. "Miss Clo needn't strut round so big. She got short, nappy hair well as I," said Nell with a broad grin that showed her teeth. "She thinks she's white when she come here with that long hair of hers," replied Mill. "Yeah," continued Nell, "Missus make her take down her wool so she no put it up today." Why are we always hating on each other? Why can't we be happy for one another? Why? The fairness of Clotel's complexion was regarded with envy as well by the other servants as by the mistress herself. This is one of the hard features of slavery. Today the woman is mistress of her own cottage. Tomorrow she is sold to one who aims to make her life as intolerable as possible. And be it remembered that the house servant has the best situation which a slave can occupy. Some American writers have tried to make the world believe that the condition of the laboring classes of England is as bad as the slaves of the United States. The English laborer may be oppressed. He may be cheated, defrauded, swindled, and even starved, but it is not slavery under which he groans. He cannot be sold. In point of law, he is equal to the Prime Minister. It is easy to captivate the unthinking and the prejudiced by eloquent declamation about the oppression of English operatives being worse than that of American slaves, and by exaggerating the wrongs on one side and hiding them on the other, but all informed and reflecting minds, knowing that bad as are the social evils of England, those of slavery are immeasurably worse. But the degradation and harsh treatment that Clotel experienced in her new home was nothing compared with the grief she underwent at being separated from her dear child. Taken from her without scarcely a moment's warning, she knew not what had become of her. The deep and heartfelt grief of Clotel was soon perceived by her owners, and fearing that her refusal to take food would cause her death, they resolved to sell her. Mr. French found no difficulty in getting a purchaser for the quadroon woman, for such are usually the most marketable kind of property. Clotel was sold at private sale to a young man for a housekeeper, but even he had missed his aim. So that ends chapter 15, I think. Yeah, that was chapter 15. And we're going to stop now for today. But I just want to comment on Horatio sold his wife and his child. How do you do this? And that happened. I mean, I'm not saying a lot of Southerners were selling their wives, But a lot of slave owners were, and not all Southerners were slave owners, I'm not saying that, but a lot of slave owners were selling people they were in romantic relationships with, and a lot of slave owners sold their children. How? How did these things happen? And now Clotel has been sold to another man, and we already learned that often quadroon women were sold for the use of their masters. So we'll see what happens next. Thanks for joining me. I'm Rashonda Cade, and this is Reading with Rashonda.